The sea did not look dangerous that morning. That was the first betrayal. On the morning of December 26, 2004, the coastlines of the Indian Ocean woke into what should have been another ordinary day. In northern Sumatra, fishermen were already thinking about the tide. In Sri Lanka, trains were beginning their routes near the shore. In southern Thailand, resort staff were preparing breakfast for holiday crowds. In India, fishing villages were stirring into motion with the kind of repetition that makes a place feel permanent. In the Maldives, islands sat low and quiet beneath a sky so calm it seemed almost protective. Nothing about the morning looked like the beginning of one of the deadliest natural disasters in modern history. That is what made it so cruel, because catastrophe did not arrive under a black sky. It did not announce itself with lightning. It did not begin with a storm visible on the horizon. It began beneath the ocean floor, in silence, in darkness, in a place no one on the coast could see. There, a massive section of the Earth's crust ruptured and shifted upward with extraordinary force. That rupture displaced an enormous volume of seawater, and from that moment on, the Indian Ocean was no longer simply water. It had become motion, it had become energy, it had become a weapon moving faster than ordinary human understanding. But the shore still looked normal. That is the aura. For people on the beaches, in the villages, in the hotels, in the homes, and on the roads, the world still looked readable. The ocean was still the ocean. The sky was still the sky. Children still laughed. Breakfast still cooked. Boats still rocked. Some people were still asleep. Some were praying, some were arguing, some were planning the day ahead. Then, in place after place, the sea began to withdraw. At first, it did not look like the violence. It looked like impossibility. It was gathering, and that is one of the most mysterious things ever recorded in disaster history. For many people, the first emotional response to the beginning of the tsunami was not fear. It was curiosity. What could make the ocean disappear? Why was the beach suddenly so wide? Why were the fish left behind? Why did the horizon feel so empty? Those were the wrong questions. The right question was the one almost no one had time to ask. What is coming back? Then came the sound. Not thunder, not stuff, not wind, a roar. A deep mechanical advancing thunder that seemed to belong less to weather than to some enormous machine tearing through the world. Survivors later described it as a train, as many engines, as the earth itself grinding forward. It was the sound of water, carrying force on a scale too large for the human body to understand before impact. Then the horizon changed. Then the sea returned, and when it returned, it no longer looked like the sea people knew. It came not as a simple wave, but as a black moving front full of mud, broken wood, vehicles, metal, glass, uprooted trees, roofs, market stalls, fishing boats, electrical poles, and people. It burst through resorts. It tore through villages. It crossed roads. It shattered walls. It entered mosques, schools, train lines, kitchens, bedrooms, courtyards, and storefronts. It reached into ordinary life and removed it. Some died in seconds. Some were dragged through debris so violent that water itself disappeared from memory, replaced by impact, darkness, and the need to breathe. Some climbed trees. Some reached rooftops. Some held one child and lost another. Some survived only long enough to watch the place they had known all their lives vanish into moving field of wreckage. And the worst part was It did not happen in one place, it happened across an ocean. By the time the world understood what had occurred, the disaster had already crossed national borders, destroyed coastlines in multiple countries, and taken more than 200,000 lives. The sea and rewritten maps interrupted economies and shattered families and turned entire communities into fields of absence. That is why the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami remains so haunting, not only because it was enormous, but because it arrived on a morning that looked safe, and because for tens of thousands of people, the last thing they saw before the world was torn away was the sea doing something beautiful enough to make them step closer. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami began on December 26, 2004, after a massive undersea megathrust earthquake struck off the western coast of northern Sumatra, Indonesia. The earthquake was one of the most powerful ever recorded, and the tsunami it generated radiated outward across the Indian Ocean with devastating force. Indonesia, especially Aceh province, was hit first and hardest, but the destruction did not remain there. Sri Lanka suffered catastrophic losses. Thailand saw some of its most famous beaches transformed into disaster zones within minutes. India was struck across multiple coastal regions. The Maldives flooded extensively. Even parts of East Africa were hit hours later, proving that this was not simply a regional emergency, but a basin-wide catastrophe. This disaster mattered for several reasons at once. It was one of the deadliest natural disasters of modern times. It affected multiple countries in a single day. It exposed the deadly absence of a coordinated tsunami warning system in the Indian Ocean, and it showed how modern populations remain profoundly vulnerable when geologic violence meets coastlines built around routine, livelihood, and trust. The tsunami did not strike empty shores. It was a story of tectonics, warning failure, coastal vulnerability, human habits, and the terrible speed with which ordinary life can be overturned when nature moves at a scale far beyond anything the eye is prepared to believe. Before the tsunami, the Indian Ocean coast was full of life that depended on normality. That is one of the reasons the disaster remains so emotionally devastating. It did not strike a landscape already marked by panic or visible instability. It struck places organized around repetition, walking, cooking, fishing, commuting, praying, cleaning, serving, resting, and expecting the day to proceed. In Aceh, the northern tip of Sumatra, the sea was woven directly into daily survival. Fishing communities lined the coast. Boats and nets were not just tools, but inheritance. Markets depended on catches. Roads ran close to low shorelines. Houses, mosques, and neighborhoods had grown in direct relationship to the sea because the sea was part of work, food, and belonging. To live there was not to risk the coast in the abstract. It was to belong to a coast in the most practical sense possible. The same was true, though differently, in Sri Lanka. Their coastal settlements formed a long, narrow chain in many regions, with rail lines and roads running near the water. Fishing villages, beach communities, and towns existed where access to the ocean made economic and geographic sense. The train lines themselves reflected that logic. So did the arrangement of homes, shops, and public spaces. Daily life was compressed close to the sea because the sea offered movement, labor, trade, and continuity. In southern Thailand, the coast held another world layered on top of local life, tourism, hotels, cafes, beach workers, divers, drivers, cooks, cleaners, and visitors from around the world occupied landscapes marketed precisely for their beauty and relaxation. The beaches represented escape. The sea represented pleasure. That emotional framing mattered because it left many people even less prepared to interpret abnormal ocean behavior as danger. In India, countless coastal communities worked in conditions shaped by generations of proximity to the sea. Nets were mended near homes. Boats sat near beaches. Family economies depended on immediate access to shoreline and harbor. This was not accidental. Human beings built at water's edge because water gives. It gives fish transport, climate moderation, beauty, and trade. That is why coasts fill with life in the first place. The Maldives embodied this truth in another way. There, the sea was not merely beside life, it surrounded it. Beautiful, shallow, low-lying islands depended entirely on the stability of ocean conditions they could not control that made them uniquely exposed to any sudden marine disturbance. Geologically, the danger had always been present. Off western Sumatra lies a major subduction zone where the Indo-Australian plate dives beneath the Burma microplate. This kind of tectonic setting is capable of producing a very large earthquake. Over long periods, sections of the plate boundary can lock, storing immense strain. When that strain is finally released, the movement can be powerful enough to deform the seafloor over huge distances and generate tsunamis that travel across ocean basins. Scientists understood that the region was tectonically active, but understanding in scientific terms does not automatically become protection in public terms. That gap became one of the deadliest parts of the event. By 2004, the Pacific Ocean had long established more advanced tsunami awareness and warning networks because repeated major events had made the danger undeniable. But across much of the Indian Ocean, no comparable fully integrated warning system existed. There were seismic sensors, there was scientific expertise, but there was no major regional architecture strong enough to immediately detect a giant undersea rupture, model the tsunami, notify multiple governments, activate coastal response, and push evacuation messages into vulnerable communities fast enough to matter. And warning systems are only one part of the story. Even where time exists, people must know what the signs mean. If the sea retreats suddenly, do you run? If the ground shakes for a long time, do you assume the coast is now dangerous? If you are a tourist, do you know that at all? If you are a child, do you know? If you are a hotel worker, a vendor, a fisherman, a passenger on a train, do you know? In many places, the answer was no. That is not a moral failure. It is a structural one. The coasts themselves were also highly exposed. Many settlements were low-lying. Many houses were lightly built. Roads ran close to beaches. Harbors and markets sat at or near sea level. Some ecosystems that might have offered partial natural buffering, such as mangroves, had been degraded or altered. Poverty in some areas forced people into the most exposed land because safer land was unavailable, too far from livelihood, or economical unreachable. It is one of the central truths of disaster history. Hazard is natural. Vulnerability is organized. The ocean basin contained tectonic danger long before 2004, but it was human settlement patterns, infrastructure gaps, social inequality, and warning failure that determined how many people were standing in the path of that danger when it arrived. And yet, if you had walked those coasts on the morning before the waves hit, you would not have been risk stamped visibly across the sand. You would have seen life. Fishermen returning, children playing, visitors taking photographs, breakfast being prepared, trains moving, boats rocking, streets opening into the day. That is what makes the tsunami feel so merciless. It did not interrupt panic, it interrupted routine. It struck a world that still believed the sea belonged to everyday life. And in a single morning, it proved that the sea can turn against the land with almost no warning at all. To understand the 2004 tsunami, you have to start with a fact that sounds simple but contains enormous violence. The seafloor moved. That movement happened because of megathrust earthquake. At a subduction zone, one tectonic plate is being pushed beneath another, but the plates do not slide smoothly all the time. They can become locked by friction. As they continue trying to move, strain accumulates in the crust. The rocks bend and store energy. Over years, decades, or even centuries, that stored energy grows. Then, when the locked section finally fails, the crust slips. And when the crust slips beneath the ocean in a way that lifts or drops the seafloor, the water above it is displaced. That displacement is what makes tsunamis possible. It is where it becomes important to distinguish tsunamis from ordinary waves. Wind waves are surface features. They are generated by wind transferring energy into the top layer of the sea. A tsunami, by contrast, involves movement of the entire water column from surface to seabed. The energy is not skimming across the top, it is distributed through depth. That is why tsunamis can carry such extraordinary destructive power. In deep ocean, a tsunami can move at a very high speed, often hundreds of miles per hour, yet the wave height out there may not seem dramatic. It is one reason tsunamis can remain visually deceptive offshore. Ships at sea may pass over them without recognizing the danger. But the wave is still there, the energy is still there, and as it approaches shallow water, everything changes. When a tsunami enters shallower coastal zones, the bottom of the wave begins interacting more strongly with the seabed. The wave slows down, but the energy has to go somewhere, so the wavelength compresses and the water rises. That is why tsunamis often grow dramatically in coastal areas, especially along certain shoreline shapes, bays, and flat, low-lying plains. A tsunami is therefore not just a wall of water, it is an energy transformation. Deep water motion becomes shallow water violence. Another key fact is that tsunamis do not always look the same. Sometimes they arrive as a towering front. Sometimes they arrive more like a rapidly rising surge or flood. Sometimes the first visible sign is not a wave at all, but the sea retreating. That retreat happens because one part of the wave structure can draw water away from the shore before the destructive crest or surge arrives. And this was one of the deadliest features of the 2004 event. People saw the retreat and did not know what it meant. The exposed seafloor, and the stranded fish, the suddenly wooden beach, these were not random oddities. They were natural warning signs of tsunami. But without education and warning culture, a sign is just a strange event. Human beings interpret the unknown through what feels familiar. Some saw a curiosity, some saw a chance to walk farther out, some saw fish to collect. By the time fear replaced curiosity, the water was already returning. The 2004 tsunami was also so devastating because the earthquake rupture was immense. The area of seafloor displacement was huge, which meant the resulting tsunami had the energy to cross the entire Indian Ocean. It was not a narrow local event affecting one bay or one island. It was basin scale. That is why countries far from the earthquake still experience major destruction hours later. Distance gave some coastlines time, but time is useless if it cannot be turned into warning. That is where the absence of an Indian Ocean tsunami warning network become catastrophic. In some countries, messages did not arrive. In others, systems to interpret and act on them were weak and non-existent. Even where there was enough time in theory, there was not enough infrastructure, training, or public awareness to move large numbers of people out of danger quickly enough. Local geography then amplified the damage. Flat coasts allowed water to travel far inland. Bays focused the surge. River mouths helped water penetrate deeper into sediments. Low islands were quickly overwhelmed. Coastal roads and railways became channels of destruction rather than escape. Fishing harbors turned boats into moving battering objects. Buildings broke apart and added timber, concrete, glass, and metal to the water, making each second of inundation more lethal. Then there is another deadly fact about tsunamis. They often come in multiple waves. The first wave is not always the biggest, and there can be dangerous intervals between surges. This means survivors may mistakenly believe the danger is over, re-enter low ground, or remain too exposed during later waves. In 2004, many communities experienced repeated surges, with each one deepening destruction and confusion. So the science of the tsunami is brutally straightforward. Tectonic strain built beneath the sea. The fault ruptured. The seafloor shifted. The ocean was displaced. Energy moved across the basin. Shallow water amplified it. Human coastlines received it. And because the people were standing where everyday life had always taught them it was safe to stand, the result was not just geophysical violence, it was mass death on ordinary ground. First true moment of the disaster happened where almost no one could witness it. Beneath the sea of northern Sumatra, the megathrust earthquake ruptured. In coastal Aceh, the earthquake itself was the first sign people felt. Buildings shook violently, walls cracked, people ran outside. Some could not stand properly because the ground motion was so intense and sustained. For those close to the source, the earthquake was already terrifying enough to enter memory as a disaster in its own right. But the earthquake was only the opening act. In near-source areas, especially parts of Aceh, the timeline between the earthquake and the first tsunami impact was brutally short. There was no meaningful space for reflection. People who had just survived violent shaking were still trying to orient themselves when the sea began to invade. Some saw the water retreat, others only heard the roar. Then the tsunami hit. In Banda Aceh and surrounding coastal districts, the destruction was immediate and nearly total in many areas. Water surged into neighborhoods at tremendous speed, carrying debris from the first seconds of impact and turning that debris into additional force. Homes collapsed, roads vanished, vehicles were flipped and swept away, fishing boats were torn from moorings and carried deep inland. Entire families disappeared. Survivors who escaped often did so by chance rather than strategy, by clinging to floating objects, being thrown onto higher structures, or finding some accidental point of resistance in the current. Then the tsunami continued outward. Across the ocean, Thailand moved unknowingly toward its own impact window. Resorts, beaches, and coastal businesses continued operating. In some areas, beach goers noticed the sea withdrawing and went toward it. There is something especially horrifying about this stage of the disaster because it reveals the gap between appearance and reality. The beach looked open, wide, fascinating. The sea looked absent. What people were actually seeing was the ocean making room for violence. When the wave arrived in Thailand, it moved through tourist zones that had been organized around beauty and leisure. Hotel pools, restaurants, beach chairs, glass walls, parked cars, market stands, luggage, and people all entered the same flood. Videos later captured the surreal mechanics of destruction, water moving through streets with deceptive steadiness, then suddenly lifting cars, smashing walls, and pulling people away. In Sri Lanka, the timeline became another sequence of horror. Coastal towns were struck with such force that many residents had almost no chance. One of the most infamous events of the day occurred when a passenger train near the coast was overwhelmed by the tsunami. People who had been inside the train for ordinary travel found themselves inside a metal trap overtaken by moving ocean. That episode became one of the most haunting symbols of the disaster because it condensed the whole catastrophe into one unbearable truth. Ordinary systems of life become death machines when they remain in the path of a force they were never built to understand. In India, waves struck fishing villages and coastal communities across a wide area. In some places, the tsunami came after enough time, and a warning might have saved more lives if a system had existed to translate geologic knowledge into immediate public action. Instead, the water reached shores where people were still conducting ordinary morning life. Boats, nets, houses, roads, and human bodies all entered the same moving destruction. The Maldives experienced extensive flooding, with low islands rapidly overwhelmed. There, the terror often came less from giant dramatic breakers than from inundation itself, a reminder that tsunamis do not need to look cinematic to be devastating. Rising water across low land is enough to cripple islands, contaminate water supplies, destroy infrastructure, and leave populations isolated. Then there was East Africa, struck hours later. By then, the event has already killed thousands elsewhere, and still the waves were moving. This long reach is one of the reasons the 2004 tsunami feels so large in human memory. The ocean did not stop after one country. It kept carrying destruction until shoreline after shoreline had taken its turn. Near the hardest hit zone, another layer of terror was still unfolding. The later waves. Survivors who had escaped the first surge faced returning water. Some climbed trees or rooftops only to find the water coming again. Some were injured during the retreating current, which can be as deadly as the incoming surge because it drags people and debris seaward with tremendous force. Others who had re-entered areas too early were caught in subsequent waves. By the time the water finally settled, the visual world itself had been altered. Roads were gone, shorelines had changed, buildings were flattened or gutted, fishing fleets were inland, train tracks were twisted, places that had felt community memory for generations had become debris plains. The day began with breakfast. It ended with entire coasts looking as if water had passed through them. No matter how large the disaster, it is always experienced at the scale of the body, at the scale of breath, at the scale of whether your hand finds something to hold. In Aceh, a teenage boy was at home with his family when the earthquake began. He remembered the house shaking so hard that he thought the walls might tear apart before he even reached the door. He ran outside with relatives and stood in the street, disoriented, trying to understand whether the danger had passed. Then he heard people screaming from farther down the road. When he turned, he saw dark water coming through the neighborhood faster than he believed possible. He ran, but the water hit him before he reached higher ground. Later, he described what followed not as swimming, but as being thrown. Timber struck him. Roof fragments hit him. Mud and salt water filled his mouth. He grabbed at debris repeatedly until one floating plank stayed beneath him long enough to keep him above the surface. When the current weakened and he finally reached the place to stand, the neighborhood he had known all his life was gone, not damaged, gone. In Sri Lanka, a mother traveling with family near the coast described the first moments after the wave as pure noise and separation. She was knocked into water filled with wood, metal, glass, and bodies. At some point, she found herself against a tree and locked both arms around a branch. That act of holding on became the entire definition of survival. She could hear voices around her, some crying for help, some calling names, some stopping mid-sentence. She could not move toward them. Hours later, when the water had withdrawn enough for her to climb down, the town she knew no longer looked like a town. It looked like something the sea had dismantled and then abandoned. She survived the water, but the worst torment began after, waiting to learn who else had. In Thailand, a hotel employee noticed the sea retreating before many others understood it was wrong. Guests gathered along the beach, pointing, photographing, laughing in confusion. He had no formal tsunami training, but instinct told him something was deeply wrong. He began shouting at people to move away from the water. Some listened, some did not. Then came the roar and the returning flood. He later described the wave not as blue or cinematic, but as gray-black and full of violence. Umbrellas, beach chairs, glass doors, scooters, suitcases, tree branches, sections of wall, and human beings all moving together as if the boundary between the built world and the ocean had collapsed completely. There were also the stories never fully gathered by cameras or interviews. Fathers who pushed children upward and were taken themselves, grandparents who could not run, passengers inside vehicles that became traps, children found alone among debris fields, alive but unable to speak, people who floated for hours on doors, mattresses, and broken roofs, people who survived the water but lost everyone else. And this is why human stories matter in disasters of this size, because aerial images can show scope, maps can show spread, statistics can show magnitude, but all these stories show that catastrophe feels like from inside. A wall of water is a number at a distance. Up close, it is splinters in the mouth, lungs filling with salt, the shock of impact, the impossible decision of which child to hold, the realization that the sound you hear is not weather and not machinery and not something you know how to survive. That is where the 2004 tsunami still lives, not only in history books but in bodies that remember. When the water finally withdrew, it did not leave a damaged world behind. It left a broken one. The dead created another crisis almost immediately. There were too many bodies, too many missing, too little capacity, and too much urgency. It is about reconstruction of human function. Water had to be made safe. Sanitation had to be restored. Medical treatment had to continue. The dead had to be handled with dignity where possible. Children had to be protected. Survivors had to be housed. Transport routes had to be reopened. Fishing communities had to be given some path back to livelihood. Schools had to be rebuilt. Records had to be recovered or replaced. And perhaps hardest of all, people had to imagine a future in places where the sea had already taken the past. The environmental impact was severe too. Saltwater intrusion damaged farmland. Freshwater sources were contaminated. Mangroves, reefs, beaches estuaries and river mouths were altered. The breeze fills clogged coastlines and waterways. In some places, the physical shape of the coast itself changed. The line between sea and land had been redrawn, sometimes subtly, sometimes brutally. The long-term consequences reach much further than the day of impact. There is another kind of aftermath too, the aftermath of trust. How do you return to the beach after that? How do you let a child go near the water? How do you rebuild a village where all roads leads back to memory of the dead? How do you wake to the sound of surf and not hear something else inside it? The 2004 tsunami damaged houses, ports, roads, and trains, but it also damaged something harder to repair, the relationship between people and the coastlines that had once felt like home. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami changed the world because it left no room for ignorance anymore. It is to run immediately inland uphill without negotiation. That lesson was written in grief on an impossible scale, but the deeper lesson is larger than warning systems. The 2004 tsunami showed that nature does not need to be malicious to become catastrophic. It only needs the right conditions, stored tectonic strain, sudden rupture, vulnerable coastlines, and enough people living where the sea has always meant life rather than danger. The disaster also revealed that the deadliest events are rarely natural in the simple sense once they reach human settlements. Their impact is shaped by poverty, infrastructure, education, ecology, governance, and whether knowledge exists before water does. And perhaps that is why the event remains so haunting, because the sea did not attack on a day already filled with fear. It attacked on a beautiful morning while breakfast was being prepared, while children were playing, while tourists were taking pictures, while trains were running, while prayer, work, and ordinary routine still believed the day belonged to them. It did not. On December 26, 2004, the Indian Ocean became a map of grief. It showed how quickly water can erase certainty, how fragile coastlines remain when the earth moves beneath them, and how terrifyingly thin the line is between ordinary beauty and unimaginable destruction. The sea did not range first, it withdrew. That may be the single most haunting image in the entire story. An ocean drawing back under bright sky, fish exposed on wet sand, children stepping closer, adults staring in fascination, the world offering one final warning in a language almost no one there had been taught to read. And then the water came back, and when it did, whole coastlines were sentenced. That is why the 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami endures in memory not only as a disaster but as a revelation. A revelation that the sea can become strange in 1 second, that the earth can kill across an entire ocean but seen, that safety can look beautiful right before it disappears, and that for all our maps, hotels, harbors, roads, railways, and routines, human life at the edge of water remains far more fragile than it wants to believe. The ocean gives, it feeds, it carries, it calms, it reflects light so beautifully that entire civilization built themselves facing it. And then, very rarely, it remembers the violence beneath it. On that morning in 2004, it remembered, and the world is still living in the shadow of what came ashore when it did.